Members of the Minot community gathered today to recognize Flag Day. Ryan Family Dealerships hosted the event in conjunction with the local Disabled American Veterans chapter. The day featured a picnic for guests, many of which were veterans and DAV members. The event also featured patriotic music and speeches on the history of Flag Day. Organizers with DAV say they've been holding the day ceremony for several years with the dealership, and the event has grown since it started.
They wanted to do something with the DAV, and we said, well, you know, Veterans Day, Memorial Day, all that stuff is covered, but how about Flag Day? And so they jumped on board.
Now, the DAV also presented a Quilt of Valor to Gene Potter, a Vietnam veteran. Some members also held a tutorial on proper disposal of an old American flag. Goodwill donations were collected to support DAV programs.